So we will continue today discussion with Professor Bruno Drweski about Palestine independent political movement. So let's talk.
Yes, so Palestine is, of course, one of the main point of contradiction of the present world. But I would just remind some geopolitical and historical points which I think are very important to understand why the Palestinian question, the Palestinian issue is so important. So first of all, if you look at the map, you see very clearly that the Palestinian borders and later the Israel borders were drawn by the British in such a shape that they cut all communications between Africa and Asia and within the Arab world, because if you take into account the fact that the southern part of Palestine was not is desert and could have been and was not given, let's say, to Palestine and later to Israel, it is not logical. The only logic of this border is that it cuts the communication between Arabs, between Asia and Africa, and between what we will call later the third world or the colonial world. And that's very important because if you look at British archives before the First World War, so before the creation of the Palestinian colony and later state of Israel, you understand that the British were always very conscious that if you control Palestine, you make the integration, the economical, the cultural, of course, but also the political integration of the Arab world and of the whole Middle East impossible. And the base, if you control the base of Palestine and later Israel, you control the Middle East, in fact. And that's very important because we have to take into account that Zionism was created in the West. Of course, it was created among Jews, but it was not created independently from colonial powers, and it was not created independently from British imperialism. And that's very, very important. And that's the basic reason why not only Palestinian Arabs, but also all Arabs, and much more important, even the whole world is looking at the Palestine issue as a central issue, consciously or unconsciously. I would say the whole mankind understands that what happens in Palestine will influence the destiny of the whole world. So this little tiny land is a very important, strategically speaking, land, independently from the fact that, of course, this land is reminding us in our conscious and subconscious the land from where the Christianity and later Islam came and so on in the world, which is important for, let's say, the Western cultural circle. But basically, it's also linked with the very strategical importance of Palestine. What is now important, if we look at the Palestinian movement, it is the fact that at the very beginning of the 20th century, there was no such thing like a Palestinian national feeling. There was an Arab national feeling. There was a territory which was called Palestine, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, where the first political trends developed there were rather Arab liberation movement against the Ottoman Empire. And this movement was not strictly Palestinian. You found the same movement, the same trends in what is now Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and so on. But the First World War showed that the British used Arabs against the Turks and they told Arabs that they will favor a united Arab state, independent state, liberated from Turkish occupation. But as soon as the war was near the end, British and French decided to divide the new conquered land and to make the creation of a united Arab state impossible, and especially Palestine. And when they decided that Palestine would be on the British side, they also decided that Palestine will be part of the Zionist project. It means the creation of Jewish, Eastern European Jewish colonies, financed by the Western Jewish bankers linked with British imperialism. And so when the immigration arrived in Palestine, when the Jewish immigration began to arrive in Palestine, we have to take into account that the local Palestinian Arabs, which were Muslims or Christian or even Jews, because you had some Jews in Palestine, Arabic Jews, at the very beginning, they were not really concerned by the Jewish immigration up to the moment when landlords living not in Palestine, but most of the landlords of the Palestinian landlords were living in Damascus, in what is now Syria, or even in Beirut, in what is now Lebanon, and they sold the land they were owners to Zionists. And this created the beginning of the Palestinian liberation movement, because as soon as Zionists took this land, they expelled Palestinian peasants. And we have to take into account, because we have the myth that Zionism at the very beginning was a secular and socialist-oriented ideology, and even strongly socialist because of the so-called kibbutz, but which are collective farms. But we have to remember one very important thing. It is that the Zionist trade unions, Histadrut, and the kibbutz movement was organized on a strictly ethnical base. It means that they forbid any Arabs to be part of their project. Histadrut was reserved for Jewish workers, the trade union, and kibbutz were reserved for Jewish colonists. So every Arab living in the place where the land was bought from landlords was already expelled, immediately expelled. Even in the interwar period, you had strikes organized by the Zionist trade union against Jewish capitalists, and demanding that the Jewish capitalists expel all Arab workers and take in his enterprise only Jewish workers. So it was, when we say that the Zionist movement at the very beginning was a socialist movement, we have to say that it was something like a national socialist movement, and not at all a real socialist internationalist movement. That we have to take into account. It doesn't mean that there were no Marxists within in Palestine, because in the pre-war period you had the Palestinian Communist Party. It was a quite tiny party, but it was a party mainly with Jewish members at that time, which were anti-Zionist and which were internationalist. But apart from this party, the Zionist movement was, let's say, national socialist or ethnical socialist, but never internationalist socialist. So this explains why the Palestinian movement began in the 20s and especially in the 30s, when you had in 1936 the national uprising of the Palestinian, which were led mostly by Muslims, organization and Muslim leaders. And this more or less was the case up to 1948. In 1948, as you know, the state of Israel was proclaimed, and Palestinians became massively refugees, but because more or less 800 Arab Palestinians were kicked out, expelled from what it was then becoming then Israel. Only about 10% of the Arab of the new Israeli land could still live in what is called later Israel. The big majority were expelled outside of Palestine, in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, or in Egypt, or in Gaza. And on the base of the defeat of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, which was against British occupation, but also against Zionist occupation, a new generation of Palestinian militants appeared, which prepared in the 50s, but basically in the 60s, what will led to the creation of the PLO. It means the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was more and more secular, and which began to be very active after the Arab army defeats in 1967. So the PLO was structured at the very beginning, a united structure. After this structure began to be pluralistic, in the sense that in the PLO you had all the Palestinian existing organization more or less cooperating. And what is important is when we talk about the PLO, of course, we have always the idea of mainly Arafat and the so-called Fatah organization, but we have to take into account that we had and we still have, to a certain extent, a different organization within the PLO. The Fatah organization is the most important one.
Bruno,
Yes.
I would like to ask one thing. In the time of the Ottoman,
Yes.
This Arab liberation movement, it was unite. I want to ask, is this question that now there are Iraqis, Syrians, Jordanians, Palestine, in the 19th century, they are divided, or it is only Arab?
They were fighting, especially during the First World War. The Arab liberation movement was directed by the Hashemite family, which was controlling from 1,000 years Mecca. And they were, of course, dependent on the Ottoman Empire. And during the First World War, the British concluded with the Hashemite, let's say, emir or sultan of Mecca, an alliance, promising him that if he goes on the side of the British, what he did, at the end of the First World War, there will be a united Arab kingdom with Arabia, Jordan, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. That all these lands will be united in a united Arab kingdom. Of course, this was, and in the same time, the British concluded with the Zionists an agreement that Palestine will not belong to this state, but will be a separate entity that will be given to the Jews. And in the same time, they began negotiation with the French, dividing the future Arab land in two parts, one under French control and one under British control. So I would say that the Arab united uprising against the Turks was completely manipulated by the British, and they were betrayed, in fact. But of course, this trend shows that the Arab masses were in favor of a big united Arab country, of a big united Arab land. And later, and it explains why, especially the Palestinian, but not only the Palestinian, after the First World War, but especially after the creation of the State of Israel, began to consider that the king, the royal system, the monarchy, the monarchies, the Arab monarchies were in fact manipulated by the colonialists, but in fact they agreed to submit to the colonialists, and that's why an Arab left began to be created, because Arab understood, especially after the defeat with Israel in 1948, but much more, of course, after the second defeat in 1967, that the monarchies, the conservative Arab monarchies, which were officially pretending to unite Arabs, were in fact completely submitted to British colonialism and later to American imperialism, and that if the Arab, and especially the Palestinian Arab, wants to fight for their freedom, they must cut ties, of course, with Western imperialism and Zionism, but they must cut ties also with monarchy. The extreme left, the Marxist organization, which was part of the PLO under George Habash, the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, after 1967, was very clear on that issue. He told his slogan was that the road to Tel Aviv must first stop by Riyadh and Amman, kick out the monarchies, even look to push the revolution in Syria and Egypt, which were supposed to be socialist, but not enough socialist according to his views, and then to destroy the state of Israel. So the idea of the left, Palestinian left, was that if Zionists created their state, it's not only because they were supported by Western imperialism. It's not only because they were Western functioning under the Western agenda in the Middle East, but it's also because the Arab monarchies, the conservative monarchies, were not only reactionary socially, but were in fact completely submitted to Western colonialism, British colonialism, French colonialism eventually, and later American imperialism. And that's the base on which we had the development all over the Arab world, but especially among Palestinians, of what we call the socialist left, or the Arab socialism, which had very different wings. Because in the Arab world, among the left, we had, let's say, more or less three tendencies. And we saw them also inside the PLO, inside the Palestinian Liberation Organization. We had, let's say, the mainstream left, which was linked more or less with the, let's say, Arab socialism, which was something like a compromise between Arab nationalism, Arab social progressive ideology, and let's say an identity more or less Islamic. The name of Fatah, the main organization of the PLO and under Arafat, the leader Arafat, was taken from the Quran. In the Quran, you have one surah, which is the surah of victory. Fat means in Arabic more or less victory, in which the Quran tells about the victory of the Muslims against the polytheists. And the name Fat was something like a compromise, let's say, between the Muslim identity and the socialist values carried on by the Fatah. And the Fatah was the main organization. So, of course, Fatah is a secular organization in this sense that it doesn't pretend to be based on religion. And it makes the difference between religion and let's say political life or ideological life, but it was never very clear what was the relation between Fatah and religion, and especially, of course, Islam. Because, of course, Islam is a religion very different from Christianity, and we have to understand that. First of all, Islam, and especially the Sunni Islam, has no clergy. There is no clergy. I mean, every Muslim can read the Quran as he wants. He has to interpret it. He can, let's say, hear what some, let's say, Muslim scholars say, but he's not obliged to. He is free to have his own view on the Quran. He can read it as he wants, and there is no such thing like Pope or bishops in Islam. So the interpretation you have of Islam can be very easily conservative or very progressive, because there is no monopoly of one school over the other. And that's quite important, because Islam can be very easily either a very archaic, ultra-conservative tool for the dominant classes, but it can also quite easily be a revolutionary ideology, because you can find in the Quran, of course, a text about equality, about social justice, and so on and so on. So because of that, and because the fact that Islam was a religion of the colonized, for a lot of Muslims, and especially, of course, in Palestine, Islam appeared as a let's say, an identity element in their fight for freedom, in a way very different, for example, of what happened in Eastern Asia. I mean, Chinese or Vietnamese, where they began their uprising against the French colonialists, English or later American, they didn't need to use, let's say, Buddhist or Confucianist ideology, because Marxism was for them the ideal tool to lead the liberation movement. In the Muslim world, it's much more complicated, because the Islam can appear quite easily as a tool of national or social even liberation. So very easily, and you saw that in Palestine, but you saw the same thing in Egypt with Nasser, you saw the same thing in Algeria with the FLN during the anti-French uprising, and in different Muslim countries, the anti-imperialist movement can quite easily be, let's say, middle of the road between Marxism and Islam. So Fatah was rather that strand, middle of the road, socialist strand, but linked with, let's say, Islamic let's say, identity. Yeah, and at the left of the Fatah, you had a lot of different organizations which joined the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, but which were much more secular. Fatah was secular, but was not very clear about its secularism. Other organizations were much more clear in their secularism, and they were divided in two trends. One less important, but we have to take it into account for geopolitical reason, was the Ba'athist one, which is a socialist ideology, a secular ideology based on national, on Arab nationalism, but which is not Marxist. And I said it's important because Syria and Iraq were states, Arab states, which in the 60s were under the power of Ba'ath, Syria up to date, and they financed some branches of the PLO which were linked with the Ba'athist, nationalist, anti-colonialist, and socialist, but not Marxist ideology. And you had the Marxist, and you had different Marxist organizations within the PLO, but the most important was the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratical Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And what is important to know about is, of course, that they were strictly Marxist organizations, which were quite often led by Palestinian, let's say, from Christian origin, because you have to remember, of course, that in Palestine, as in the whole Middle East, of course, the big majority of the population is Muslim, and especially Sunni Muslim. But you have strong religious minorities. You have the Jewish minority, but you have also very strong Christian minorities. And Arab nationalism and Marxism, especially, was much more appealing. Strict Marxism was much more appealing for people from Christian origin, because it solved the let's say the minority question, which was the case for them inside a Muslim society. So it's of course, as everywhere in the world, when you belong to a minority. You had the same thing in Russia before the revolution, and you had the same thing in a lot of countries, in Turkey or in Western Europe even. When you belong to a national minority or to a religious minority, it's much more appealing to be Marxist, it means internationalist, than when you belong to the majority. We had the same thing in Poland in the pre-war period. Communism was much more appealing for a Polish citizen of Jewish or Belarusian, of Ukrainian origin, than for let's say, a pure Pole from Catholic origin, because he was belonging to the majority. And you find this situation all over the world. And of course, Lenin and especially Stalin took that very seriously into account at the beginning of the 20th century. So the situation was, of course, the same in Palestine. The non-religious Marxist ideology was much more appealing for the Christian, let's say, for the people of Christian origin than for people of the majority Muslim origin. And that's explained why in the PLO, the Fatah was rather an organization much more massive, because to a certain extent, even if it was a secular organization under Arafat, it was a leftist organization. It was linked with some, let's say, visible elements of Islamic tradition. secularized Islamic tradition, but still Islamic tradition, contrary to the left of the PLO, and especially the People's Front, which were strictly Marxist-Leninist, atheistic, but mostly linked with people, not mostly, maybe not, but partly linked with people having Christian roots, and this has to be taken into account. But anyway, the PLO was very active in the after the Arab defeat of 1967 on the local, of course, ground, because they organized what Israel called terrorism, but in fact a war in the occupied territories, but also they organized among the Palestinian diaspora. We have, of course, to remember what I told earlier, that about half of the Palestinians didn't live in Palestine anymore from the 1948 wars, and that about half of the Palestinians were living in as refugees in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And they organized the PLO among refugees. They organized their military wings, fighting on the border on the ceasefire line with Israel. What also was very important at that time, and that's why Palestinians were described in the Israeli medias, but also in Western medias, as terrorists. What is very important is that at that time they understand that the fight for Palestine has no chance to win if it will be limited to fight in Palestine. I mean, the Israeli army was much more, much stronger than the Palestinian Fedayeen, the Palestinian military militants. The Palestinians understood also that most Arab states were just pretending to help Palestinians, but in fact they were betraying them, especially the monarchies and especially the King of Jordan. But even the so-called progressive Arab state like Nasser's Egypt or Baathist Syria were, let's say, helping Palestinians, but wanting to control them, and they were fearing that the Palestinian movement is too revolutionary according to their own policies and to their own tendencies. So the Palestinians did understand quite quickly that they are very isolated politically, and the support they have from governments are just insufficient, but that they have strong support among Arab masses, not only Palestinian masses, but Arab masses, which were, of course, much more revolutionary than their government. And they also understand that on the base of the anti-colonial movements, broader than in the Arab world, it means the Chinese national liberation movement, Vietnamese national liberation movement, Pan-Africanist national liberation movement, Cuban Revolution, and so on and so on. They understood that they are the central part of the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movement, and that they must show to the world that they exist. And that's why they decided the hijacking of quite a lot of civil planes, Swiss planes, Israeli planes, and so on, which, of course, literally speaking, can be described as act of terrorism, in the sense that civil civil passengers, having no link at all with Palestine question, can be considered as, let's say, kidnapped by Palestinian terrorists. But we have to take into account that from the Palestinian point of view, Western power and Western societies were ignoring the rights of the Palestinian, and it was very important to remember the whole world that they are existing. And we have to take into account that that's the fact. Maybe it doesn't please to a lot of people, but that's a basic fact that up to the end of the 60s, almost nobody outside the Arab world, and especially nobody in the Western world, knew about Palestinian issue. For a lot of people, even for progressive people, leftist people in the West, the conflict was between Israel and Arab states. But it was not a conflict taking into account the fact that the local people, the Palestinian Arabs, had been expelled from their country for half of them and are under occupation for the second half of them. So for the Palestinian, it was very important, and it is a success for them that the hijacking of a lot of planes made the Palestinian question appear in the world media. From the end of the 60s up to the beginning of the 70s, the world and the world media, due to the so-called Palestinian terrorism, discovered that there is such things like Palestinians, which are Arabs, of course, but which have their own history, their own tragedy, and that this situation cannot be solved by an agreement between existing Arab states and Israel, that this question has to be solved taking into account the local people which is colonized or expelled from its country. And that's, to a certain extent, we can say that Palestinian succeeded to make the world know that they are a political nation, and they are not just Arabs linked with existing Arab states, but they want their own country back, and they want their own government, of course, if they want their own country. And that's one point which is very important. Militarily, of course, Israel was stronger, and up to today is stronger, but psychologically, I would say that the 70s, in spite of the fact that the Palestinians were betrayed in Jordan and expelled by the Jordanian army, and that they were also defeated by the Israeli army in Lebanon later. Of course, we have to take into account that the Palestinian issues now is known all over the world due to the activity of the PLO and different groups from PLO, especially Fatah, as I told you earlier, and also the People's Liberation Front of Palestine. And this led to the situation we experienced later. It means that for the 70s and the 80s, the Palestinian liberation movement was mostly a military movement, carrying on military actions, even if also they developed diplomatic activity, and their success was, of course, their main success was that they had they had the linked they were linked with the national liberation movement of the what is called now the global South. I mean, the former colonial countries, African countries, Arab countries, and also the support of socialist countries in the 70s and 80s. And the PLO would never develop at that time if they would not have the help, the military help or the diplomatic help of socialist countries and anti-colonial countries, and that's of course very important. But in fact, of course, Israel was still dominating Palestine and was of course much stronger militarily, and this explains why step by step among what I would say the Palestinian bureaucracy, because to a certain extent, the PLO and Arafat, as soon as they began to be worldwide known, as soon as they began to be active on the diplomatical ground, they began to think that maybe they can have success using rather diplomatic tools than military tools, especially since the fact, and we have to take into account, that the PLO military bases were displaced from near Palestine lands, in Jordan first, and later Lebanon, and where they're defeated, basically were defeated, even after very tough fights, but they were defeated. And at the very end, the PLO had to take refuge in Tunisia, which is very far from Palestine. And during that time, Western powers, especially Western European powers, officially began to take into account the Palestinian issue. And it was appearing at that time that maybe there can be a political compromise because of the pressures of Soviet and socialist camp on one side and Western European countries on the other side, to force Israel to something like a territorial compromise, tending to the creation of the so-called two-state solution. Because up to that time, the Palestinian liberation movement program was that Israel is a colonial state and must disappear and be replaced by a new Palestine for the local Arabs occupied up till then, and for the expelled Palestinian refugees in neighboring countries. And taking into account that the fact that there are Jews now in Palestine that could be integrated to the new Palestine society within a secular, democratic Palestinian state. That was the official line of the PLO up to the so-called Oslo Agreement. When the Oslo Agreement appeared, the idea was that the one-state solution is not realistic anymore, and that we have to take into account the fact that there are two people in the same land, so that we have to create two states, and that alongside with Israel on the rest of the occupied Palestine, it means more or less 20% of Palestine, there should be a Palestinian state, a Palestinian independent state, alongside with Israel. But this theory of two states is, of course, quite unclear because, first of all, it doesn't give answers to the refugee question. What will happen with the refugees which are outside Palestine? Will they be repatriated to their country, and will they be back in their old homes inside what became Israel, or inside the little tiny new Palestinian state. But anyways, this two-state solution was the solution that was accepted finally by Yasser Arafat and let's say the mainstream of the PLO, with the exception of the People's Liberation Front, which up to date is fighting for a united, democratic and secular Palestine. But of course, as I told you, the People's Front was rather a very active, but still quite little organization. And this created the ground for the development of what we call more or less the Islamic or the Islamist movement within Palestine. What is called mostly now Hamas, but not only, because there is also the Islamic Jihad Palestinian movement, which is less important than Hamas, but which is quite important anyway in the Palestinian political scene. And then we have to understand that within the Arab world, paradoxically, I say within the Arab world and not the Islamic world, because basically we had the creation in the pre-war period of what is called the Muslim Brotherhood. Officially, of course, it's a political trend which is supposed to develop inside the Islamic world, as it is, of course, named, but in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood didn't really succeed to develop outside the Arab world. And if we observe the reality, the Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamic association that developed within the Arab world. So it's a Arab Islamic organization, much more than a pan-Islamic organization, if in spite of its program and of its name. And the Islamic Brotherhood was mostly at the very beginning based in Egypt. And of course, I will not talk about the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, but what is important to know for Palestinian issues is that from the very beginning, in the 30s and in the 40s, the Muslim Brotherhood had a wing inside Palestine. But the tactic of the Muslim Brotherhood was not really political in the strict sense of the word at the beginning. We have to take into account that for what we call Islamist, but of course I'm talking about, let's say, traditional Islamist. I'm not talking about such groups like ISIS or Al Qaeda and other ones, which will appear later. The idea, the basic idea of the Muslim Brotherhood was not to fight mostly on the political ground. For them, it was much more important to create a new Islamic culture and a new Islamic society than to fight to take power. So in Palestine especially, they let the Palestinian, let's say, secular movement to develop, and they concentrated on cultural questions, education questions, and social questions, especially concerning help for the poor, the disabled, and so on. So what we can say, the Islamic movement in Palestine could appear as not really important up to the, let's say, the 70s, and even I would say the 80s and the end of the 80s. At that time, under Israeli occupation, as I told you, there was the question of the two-state solution that appeared. And of course, for a large part of the Palestinian masses, the two-state solution looked like a capitulation. And that's one thing which is very important. The second thing we have to take into account, of course, that in the 80s and much more in the 90s, all over the world, not especially in the Arab world, all over the world, the left, and especially the Marxist left, was in crisis due to the fact we had in Eastern Europe the dismantling of Soviet Union and so on and so on. So the Palestinian question, at the same time the world left a situation, led inside the Arab society and especially inside Palestinian society to, let's say, consider that the national liberation Palestinian movement and that the Arab national liberation movement, but also the Arab socialism and also the Arab Marxism failed. And on this ground began to develop two organizations. The main one was the Hamas. The less important one was the Islamic Jihad of Palestine. The Islamic Jihad of Palestine was very, let's say, influenced by the very important event happening at the end of the 70s and especially at the beginning of the 80s, which is the Iranian Revolution. Since you know that the Iranian Revolution took very quickly, not from the very beginning, but very quickly, the Iranian Revolution took an Islamic trend rather than a Marxist trend. The Iranian Revolution created among Muslim masses the feeling that after all the secular, more or less communist-oriented 20th century revolution we had in Russia, we had in China, we had in different parts of the world, in Cuba and so on and so on. Now it's the time of Islamic revolution because Islam is giving a much more solid answers to the basic problem of humankind than Marxism. Of course, it's what I'm telling now is very short and brief. Huh? It's of course much more complicated, but of course I have to be short. And on this base, you had the development of the Islamic Jihad of Palestine, which was on the side of the Iranian Revolution, and we had the Hamas, which was linked with the Muslim Brotherhood, and they decided that since the PLO began to look for the diplomatic road and resign from the military resistance, they will promote the military resistance, and they will not accept the two-state solution, and that they will rehabilitate the one-state solution, which the PLO basically resigned from. And of course, that's the beginning of what we call the Hamas, and the fact that this movement succeeded to get the approval of the majority of the Palestinian during the election. I don't remember exactly the date, the year of the election. I think it's 2004.
No, it's 2006.
2006, yeah. 2006, the Hamas won the election, at least in Gaza and West Bank. Of course, we cannot tell what would have been the result of the election outside Palestine among refugees or inside Israel 1948 borders. But at least in that part of Palestine, Hamas won the election, competing with PLO and especially with Fatah on the ground that they fight for national liberation, they fight for the one-state solution, and they appear to be more radical than the former radical Fatah. And of course, they criticize also the fact that the Palestinian Authority under Arafat and later Abbas became to be more and more bureaucratized, more and more, let's say, bourgeois-like, and collaborating with Israel. Because what we have to take into account, and it's a fact, of course, it's a fact that for secular movement is not very pleasing to hear, but we have to take it into account that when the Israeli accepted after the Oslo agreement to create the Palestinian Authority, they accepted also to create a Palestinian police. But this police is collaborating with the Israeli police. And for a lot of Palestinians, they appear as traitors or as collaborators of the occupants. And of course, that's one of the reasons why the Hamas succeeded, because of course they appeared as resistance fighters, in spite of the fact that at the very beginning of their existence, the Israelis were rather quite happy with the appearance of Hamas, not only because they divide the Palestinian opinion, but because they thought at the very beginning that an Islamic movement, a religious movement, will be less extremist than a secularized leftist and eventually Marxist movement. But very quickly, they realized that Hamas was much more radical than the Fatah movement and Arafat at that time, and later, especially Mahmoud Abbas. Of course, they discovered that, let's say they did, for their point of view, of course, the wrong choice. And up to today, of course, their main enemy is the Hamas or the Islamic Jihad, and not the Fatah. But we have also to take into account, because now the war we had this week, the late week, if we look at the Western media, we have the impression that you have on one side the Hamas and in Gaza, and on the second side Israel. And it's of course completely partly false, because first of all, we have the war now is all over Palestine. The uprising is all over Palestine. We had a strong manifestation in the West Bank. We had strong manifestation in the East Jerusalem. We had strong manifestation inside Israel, in Haifa, in Lod, in Tel Aviv, and so on. And of course, we had the resistance of Gaza. But when we talk about the resistance of Gaza, of course, Gaza is under power of Hamas, that's right. But in Gaza, you have all the Palestinian factions with their military wings. And the fight in Gaza is coordinated under the resistance coordination, military coordination, where, of course, the Hamas plays the more important role, because they have rockets and much more modern weapons. But the resistance coalition is regrouping the Islamic Jihad, the People's Front, and also, what is very important, the military wing of the Fatah, which is called the Al-Aqsa Brigades. So we can say that it's not Hamas fighting against Israel. Gaza, it's united resistance, where the Hamas is the most important organization, but not the only one. All Palestinian organizations in Gaza are fighting together against Israel, and they coordinate their activities, in spite of the tension we have between Ramallah, the official, let's say, Fatah, their direction, and Gaza on the top. But basically on the ground, we have a national united front of Marxists, Islamists, and let's say more or less socialist wings of the movement. So that the way the Western and the Israeli propaganda is showing that it's a war between Hamas and Israel, it's of course because they want to create the impression that Gaza is under the power of a group of religious fanatics, not taking into account that they are cooperating with even Marxists in the resistance movement. What takes into account even the Jewish left in Israel. It's very tiny now. The Jewish anti-Zionist left in Israel is not important, politically speaking, but still it exists. And they consider that, of course, Israel is a colonial state, and that Zionism is an ideology that has to be dismantled, and that what we have in Gaza is a resistance movement and not only an Islamic program movement. Yeah, more or less. That's. I don't know if you have questions now.
Yes. So now I would like to ask you about the geopolitical question in the history. In the time of existence of the socialist bloc, could you say something? What was the position of the Soviet Union, the countries like Poland in the times of 1916, 17, 18, and also the communist movement, and not only communist movement, the communist parties which are collaborated with the communist parties of the Soviet Union, but also the leftists from the Western countries, from the West Germany, from the United States, maybe. Could you say something about this? What was this collaboration between them and the Palestine Liberation Movement?
We can say that up to 1947, when the United Nations accepted the plan to divide Palestine, the communist movement was very clear against Zionism as such, and was against the idea that Jews must have their own state, because it was a colonial idea, especially that we have to take into account that the Soviet Union created for the Jews at that time in the 30s, in the Soviet Far East on the Chinese border, the Jewish autonomous region of Birobidzhan. So for the Soviet Union, the Jewish question was solved in Soviet Union by the creation of this autonomous region, and there was no point to create a new Jewish entity in the Middle East, since they had their Jewish entity inside Soviet Union. And even we have to remember that at the very beginning of this entity, Soviet Union appealed Jews from all the world to come to Soviet Union and to build the socialist Birobidzhan. Later, it didn't really function. That's another thing, the history of Birobidzhan. Even if officially up to date, the Birobidzhan still exists. In Russia, you have the Jewish autonomous region of Birobidzhan up to date, but it's a rather a fiction than a reality. But as I told you, up to 1947, the point of view of communist movement was that Palestine must be decolonized, and that Palestine should be an independent state, non-ethnical, non-religious, secular, democratic, and eventually, of course, socialist. And that was the point of view, of course, of the Communist Party of Palestine up to 1947. In 1947, Soviet Union decided for, let's say, pure tactical reason, that they will support the idea of two states in Palestine and the creation of Israel, taking into account the fact that most Arab regimes at that time were reactionary, pro-British, pro-American, and that the Zionists were looking like potentially socialists. This was a very short period when the Soviet Union and communist movement promoted the creation of Israel, let's say between 1947 and 1949. In 1949, Soviet Union discovered that Israel was not a progressive base in the Middle East. That it was turning on the side of the United States during the Cold War, that it was even corrupting, from the Soviet point of view, Soviet Jews, when Golda Meir, who was a minister in the Israeli government, arrived in Moscow and began to take contact with the local Jewish communities. So you had a change in the trend of Soviet Union, especially when later, step by step, appeared more and more republics, progressive republic in the Arab world. After Nasser took power in Egypt, later the republic and the Iraqi revolution killed the Iraqi king and created the republic in Iraq, and you had all trend toward the socialist movement in the Arab world, in Algeria, in Yemen, and so on. At that time, Soviet Union and communist movement discovered that basically the Arab are rather left-oriented, and that Israel is going on the right side. But of course, there was the problem of what to do with communists in the state of Israel. And what is important, the Communist Party of Palestine, which existed before 1947, was split in two after the creation of the state of Israel. You had, of course, on the Arab side, the communists created the Communist Party of Jordan, since Palestine, Arab lands were annexed at that time to Jordan, and the one who were on the Israeli side of the border created the Communist Party of Israel. The Communist Party of Israel was, as I told you earlier, rather a Jewish party with an Arab minority. And the situation changed completely after 1948, because after 1948, the new Communist Party of Israel, step by step, began to be more and more Arab and less Jews. And that's why now, when in the political Israeli discourse, in the media course, when you talk in Israel about what they call the Arab parties, they joined the Communist Party as an Arab party. Of course, it's not completely true, because you have a Jewish minority within the Communist Party of Israel, but basically, of course, the communists in Israel are mostly Arabs, contrary to the situation before 1947, 1948. But this situation I described created, of course, the idea that within the communist movement, that since Israel is existing as a state, since it was promoted by Soviet Union, this state has to be maintained. Of course, changed basically, and step by step, Soviet Union and the majority of the communist movement accepted the idea of the future, let's say, two-state solution I told you about earlier. But it was, of course, not the case of all the Marxist left, especially due to the fact that inside the Palestinian movement, the Marxists were in favor of the one-state solution, especially the People's Front of Liberation of Palestine, which was much stronger among Palestinian Marxists than the communists, strictly speaking, the Communist Party. That's one point. The second point is that during the China-Soviet split, China took the side of the People's Front, and they accused Soviet Union of compromising, of accepting the Israeli Zionist entity, and the Chinese, especially in the 60s, were strongly supporting Palestinian radical movement, and radically, of course, anti-Zionists. So what we can say, the Maoist movement in the world in the 60s were, let's say, taking the Palestinian issue as a symbol of the opportunistic, let's say, position of the Soviet or pro-Soviet communist parties. And this, of course, explains why in the West left, you had different tendencies. Since the pro-Palestinian movement developed in the West, you had, of course, let's say, pro-Palestinian movement more or less linked with communist parties, which were in favor of the idea that the state of Israel should be democratized, socialized, but that the refugee can come home, but basically Israel has not to be dismantled, but changed. And the, let's say, more extreme left, Maoist, but not only Maoist, were on the side that there should be, that the Palestinians should decide what they want for Palestine, because they are the master of their land, and that Jews are just colonists coming in the land which is not theirs, and let the Palestinians decide how they want to cope with this, let's say, Jewish issues in Palestine. And this, of course, divided the left in the Western world, but also inside the Arab countries, because in different Arab countries, you had quite strong communist parties, which were linked with Soviet Union, and which position on the Palestinian question looked for a lot of Arab progressists as, let's say, a little bit opportunistic. And we can say that the Soviet position on Palestine issues didn't help the local communists to be observed by Arab masses as a real national liberation and social liberation movement. And it's one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why the communist parties, which were quite strong or even very strong in some Arab countries as Iraq, as Sudan, as Syria, even as Egypt, began to be bypassed by more leftist-oriented movement on one side and by Islamist movement on the other side. And the situation that appeared in the 80s and 90s, especially, as I told earlier, under the massive impression created by the Iranian Revolution, that created the idea that Islam will be the revolutionary ideology of the 21st century, after Marxism having been the ideology of revolutionary ideology of the 20th century. Of course, now the situation has still changed, but it was very important in the 80s, 90s. This idea was quite strongly represented, and the position of communists, due to the Soviet position on Israel, didn't really help, let's say, the communists in the Arab world.
Okay, and now I would like to ask you about the geopolitical situation today, because
Ah,
we have country like USA,
yeah.
which are totally support the Israel. We have country like Iran, which support the Palestinians. So could you say which countries in the world and why and they support Palestinians, and if the European Union is totally they support Israel, or what is the position? From
First of all, situation is changing even in the United States. Of course, I would not say that the United States have completely changed their position, but the balance of power inside United States is changing. What you could observe last week with the huge manifestation in favor of Palestine in New York City. And what is important, it was a massive manifestation of young people from every origin, including Jews. So it's very important because it's something completely new. For the first time in the American history, you have Congress people. Of course, it's a tiny group, but still, people in the Congress of the United States, member of the Democratic Party, that asked that the help of United States to Israel must be under conditions. And what is most important is that whenever you had war in the Middle East, including the last one, not the last one of this week, but the earlier ones, you have always had strong Zionist manifestation against the pro-Palestinian manifestation. Now the situation has completely changed. For the first time, you had huge pro-Palestinian manifestation in Europe and United States and in different countries such like South Korea and so on, but you had no pro-Israel manifestation. It means that the Zionist organization couldn't manage, for the first time in their history, to mobilize their supporters in counter manifestations. And it's very important because if you look at the opinion poll in United States among Jewish society, American Jewish society, you observe that the anti-Zionist trend began to be in majority among the young ones. I mean, young Jews, young American Jews, seems to be more and more fed up with the Israel policies. And that's quite important because it means things are changing. And it's the same in Europe. The London manifestation, pro-Palestine manifestation last week was the biggest pro-Palestinian manifestation in all the history of London City. And it's something very symbolical if you take into account the fact that England created the Zionist problem in Palestine. So if London, which is the base of the Zionism, of the colonial Zionism, was strongly mobilized in favor of Palestine last week, it means situation is changing all over the world, and including Jewish communities. And especially American Jewish communities and British Jewish communities. So situation is quite different from the situation we knew we had earlier, and to a certain extent, of course, we can think what we want about Hamas. Of course, ideologically or whatever you want, but we have to take into account facts, as Lenin told, and the fact is that this time the resistance of Gaza changed quite a lot of things among let's say social stratas of societies. Of course, governments are in a different situation. Quite a lot of government are still pro-Israel. But even if you look at what Biden said last week, he's not giving the tough pro-Israeli discourse we knew from earlier times, and it's the same thing in Western Europe. What has changed is not only the moral question, that of course Palestinian have rights and Israeli are the aggressor, the occupiers, and so on. This is of course an important issue, but it's not only that. The important issue is that the balance of power, the world balance of power is changing. And now we have emerging powers like China, like Russia, like Iran on a lesser level, and that Western imperialist countries are not so strong as they were. The United States have leading, let's say, psychological, economical wars, and sometimes, of course, military wars during the last 30 years after the collapse of Soviet Union. But now they are in deep crisis, in deep economical crisis, and they just cannot afford to carry on pressures all over the world. They have to choose which adversary they will fight against and which one are secondary adversary they cannot fight. And of course, it appears very clearly from the last time, from the end of Obama era up to Biden, including Trump time, that the United States are becoming to consider that their main enemy is China. And that, of course, the main front lines are in Eastern Asia, or eventually linked with Eastern Asia, Indian Ocean. And that way, of course, they try to make an alliance, a military alliance with Modi's India against China. But in this context, the situation on, let's say, the front with Iran and with Russia is becoming for them difficult because they cannot afford to fight everybody in the same time. And of course, it's logical. They try to take Iran on their side. So now we have negotiations and indirect and direct negotiations between Iran and United States on Iranian issues, of course, especially the so-called atomic issues. But in this situation, of course, the situation of Palestine is changing. It means it's obvious that the Iranians have links, very strong links, with what they call the axis of resistance. It means Iran, Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Gaza, and that this and Yemen eventually also the Houthis in Yemen, and this make of Iran an important power, regional power in the Middle East, which of course use the Palestinian issues as one of the most important, let's say, diplomatic issues for them, even also, of course, military issues. So the situation of the Palestinians now is evolving, and that's why also Israel leadership is panicking, because they feel that they do not have the same support from Western countries they had in former years. So they try to be very strong, but they feel that their position is not so strong as it was earlier. Of course, I don't know what will happen because a lot of things will depend on the evolution inside United States establishment, inside Western European establishment. For example, Merkel yesterday told something which sounds strange, especially in the German discourse, since, as we know, because of the Second World War, Germans were always very careful concerning every questions more or less linked with Jewish questions, for obvious reason. And Merkel yesterday told that it's very good that there is a ceasefire now in Gaza, but this ceasefire cannot be considered as the end of the conflict, since Israel has to accept to make concessions to solve the political problem and the national problem, and that the solution cannot be military. In the mouth of a German leader, it means that if Germany is changing tone, it means that Western Europe is also changing tone, because, as I told you, Germany is especially concerned by Jewish issues for historical reason, but other European countries are not so strongly concerned by Jewish issues. So they will, of course, evaluate in a quite quick way. Russia also, which has very strong links with Israel due to the fact that you have about 1 million Russian citizens, Israeli citizens, but also Russian citizens or Russian-speaking citizens in Israel. Russia had a very strong relation with Israel after the collapse of Soviet Union, of course. But now Putin also was very tough this week, telling about the fact that Russia is a Middle Eastern power and that Israel cannot do what it wants. So the tide is changing. I don't know how much situation will evaluate, but anyway, Israel is not so strong as it was in the earlier times. And of course, whatever we think of what happened last week, psychologically, Arab people and especially Palestinian people feel they won the war. They didn't win the war militarily, but they won the war psychologically. Of course, you can deny that and say it's illusion, it's not true, and so on and so on. But what is important in politics is not what you would like people to think; it's what people really think. And Gaza people most openly feel they won the war, even if, of course, they had a lot of casualties, and that the Palestinian movement is to a certain extent reunified because you had common action in Gaza, in West Bank, in Israel, and in the diaspora, with Palestinian of Lebanon and Jordan trying to cross the border with Israel. And even in Jordan, they succeeded for a moment to cross the border, to force the border. So now you have a strong feeling of unity among Palestinians at the very moment where there is a strong political crisis inside Israel, because of course Netanyahu used this war to reinforce his position against his adversaries within the Israeli establishment. But now the war is over, at least for a moment, and quite a lot of Israeli consider they lost the war, because for the first time in the history, you had 4 million people, Israeli people, who had to spend night in shelters. So now, they fear the situation, even if their situation military is much better than the Palestinian one, that's obvious. But still they have they fear that they can be bombed too. So the situation is evolving, and I think that things will change quite quickly.
Okay. Last time you said something about the demonstration in Paris, that it was forbidden. Do you know other examples in the world, forbidden demonstration, or it is only France which
Only Paris. Paris is the even in Israel there were no forbidding of manifestation. Of course, the police repressed Palestinian and so on, but there were no official forbidding. France is the, let's say, for the moment, France is the most reactionary country in the world concerning at least Palestinian issues. But I think it's not only Palestinian issues. It's the fact that the Macron government wants to control the population, the society, and he forbids quite a lot of manifestation, including pro-Palestinian manifestations, but not only pro-Palestinian manifestation. But what is important that the manifestation did happen last weeks, and this time the manifestation were legal. So 1 week after, the Macron government officially had to give up and to accept manifestation. And what is important, the manifestation in France, like in other parts of the world, were massively young manifestations. Very young people came to this manifestation, and it means that, the Palestinian question, the Palestinian issue is appearing again, like it was in the 70s, as the symbolic question of young progressist people after the Vietnam War. Of course, in the 60s, Vietnam was the symbol of anti-capitalism, anti-systemic tendencies, and anti-imperialist. In the 70s, the Palestinian question took the place the Vietnamese question had earlier, and later it disappeared. And now I think it's becoming back because the huge manifestation you had, and especially the fact that a lot of young people joined manifestation, very young people, so-called depoliticized people, began to politicize themselves along the Palestinian issue, is something which is quite important. Well, it seems to me at least very important.
I wanted to ask something, but I forgot what I. Because it is commenter here a little stupid. Nobody normal with brain, heart, moral sense of justice, etc. would never have anything to do with an ideology where today's knowledge have murdered over 150 million of its own citizens. Seek help as soon as possible. So it is anti-communist. I know what I wanted to ask.
But it has nothing to do with Palestinian question.
Yes. No,
we can debate over that, but it's a completely different question.
It is because of the name of channel, Rebirth of Communism.
Yes.
So somebody who seek the communist speaking live, so he came here and make this comment. So my question is about China, because do you think that because now the most we have there are new Cold War against China, which is started by the imperialist countries from the West, and because they started to pretend to be the friends of the Muslim people from the eastern China, from the Xinjiang province, the Uyghur nation. They started to make all these accusations that the Chinese killed the Muslims, they destroyed the mosques there, and they want to pretend that now the Western countries are the allies of the Muslim religion, Muslim people, and because of that, because China is most important than the question of the Eastern Middle East, so they wanted to. They can't be allied with Uyghurs and in the same time supported the killings of Palestinians. So
Yeah, not only the killing of Palestinians, but also the main ally of the United States in Asia is India, which is now repressing in a very tough way Kashmir people, which is a Muslim people, basically a Muslim region of India. So it's a double standard. I mean, imperialists are always using ethnical or religious question when it fits to them, fighting against the same in other parts of the world. So they supported Muslims when they were fighting against Soviet Union in Afghanistan, but later they occupied Afghanistan and conquered this country, and so on and so on. So that's important. The second thing is the Xinjiang and Uyghur question you talk about. Of course, the big propaganda campaign all over the world was at the very beginning, let's say, a success for the American, but now things have changed because China reacted, inviting a lot of journalists and people to look what is the real situation in Xinjiang, and they concentrated on journalists coming from Muslim countries, so especially from Pakistan, from Malaysia, from Iran, from Turkey even. And these people told a completely different story about what happened in Xinjiang and about the roots of terrorism in Xinjiang, because of course there was a strong terrorism in Xinjiang. So the situation appears much more clear than we had earlier, and officially. We have to say that the Islamic Conference, the name is Islamic Conference countries. I'm not sure the official name. I mean, the association regrouping all Muslim countries in the world approved the Chinese policy against terrorism in Xinjiang. So it's very funny that you have pro-Muslim in the Western, supposedly Christian, let's say, quote, countries, which are much more pro-Muslim, quote, than in the Muslim countries. So it means, of course, that the situation is not exactly as it was planned at the very beginning. And I think that all these Xinjiang issues will appear very different than it was earlier planned in Washington or Brussels. That's one thing. And especially, of course, the situation in Palestine will help in that direction. As I told you, Islam is a very, let's say, complicated issue, since, as I told you, Islam is not a hierarchically organized religion, and you had very different schools within Islam. I say schools because you have no clergy, you have schools, and you have very different schools. And of course, it can help conservative trends and imperialist trends to use some schools on their side, but you will always find Islamic schools on the other side. So Islam is not monolithic. Christianity is not, but is organized in different churches. Islam is not monolithic, but is not organized on the base of churches. So nobody, no country, no state will never be able to control Islam as it has been done with Christian churches. It's a completely different tradition. And this creates, of course, a situation which doesn't help imperialists, because they can, for example, use Islam as a tool, but the ones they use can change alliance very quickly. Because they have no central direction. So it's Islam is something you can use on both sides. I would rather, if I was a rational Western leader, capitalist leader, which I'm not, I would rather advise them to be very cautious using Islamic questions, because as we saw, for example, in Afghanistan, of course, they managed to create Afghan problem that created a huge problem for Soviet Union. But later, it created a huge problem for the American, and now the American have to leave Afghanistan because they lost the war. They lost the war in Afghanistan objectively. So they have to be very cautious about using Islam, and I would advise them not to try to use Islam because earlier or later it will go against them. And on this point of view, I think Chinese and Russian are much more rational. They know that they don't really need to use Islam, because Islam it cannot be used as a tool, and it's better to leave a religious question for religion and not trying to politicize too much religion. But it's normal, because, you know, Russia is a country where Islam existed from the very beginning. I mean, southern Russia was touched by Islam earlier than by Christianity. North Caucasus region was under Islamic influence when Russian Slavs were still not Christians. And China had the Muslim minorities, not only the Uyghurs, but had Muslim minorities from the earlier Middle Age. So they know how to manage Islam much better than the Western world with its colonial tradition. So I think that they know how to manage that. They can lose position tactically, but strategically they are much more prepared to have positive relation with the Muslim world.
Well, we have to finish because my wife. But I want to say two things. Firstly, about Afghanistan. That in Afghanistan, the United States, and there are now 2,000 soldiers of United States, but there are 20,000 soldiers, which are the members of the private armies, and they stayed. This is the American, but also the citoyen from all over the world, but they are working from this private organization. So in Afghanistan, it is not that USA killed this war; they privatized this war.
Yeah, but that's the very big problem, and that's a very big issue. It's another issue, but that's the issue of the Western imperialism. It's that the imperialism is becoming more and more a mercenary imperialism, and history tells us that when an empire begins to use mercenaries, is the beginning of the decay of empires.
Yes, but I also want to say that today, before our conversation, I watched two movies in the channel, which name is Invent the Future. Mm-hmm. It's first videos which I wanted to recommend, which was published yesterday. It's what's going on in Xinjiang, and it is good presentation. And also after I watched the conversation with Li Jingjing about ethnic minorities in China. She is the report journalist from China, and she speak about Chinese problems in Tibet and also in Xinjiang. And in these two movies which I watched, I heard that the population of the Uyghur are growing.
Yes, that's nice.
numbers of the mosques in this region
Yes.
are growing, and they
Yes.
are there are more in for 1,000 people. There are more mosques in Uyghur region in Xinjiang province than in Arab countries.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. As
and
I told
also and also that Chinese state they give prime for the people who are learning language of the minorities.
yeah,
So
yeah,
if you because she speak about all these lies about the China there, and she all these lies that she destroy.
yeah.
Very
Yeah,
so.
yeah, that's important. You can send me later the link to that.
Okay, okay.
This website. So if it would be interesting for me because I'm taking part in a book about China, so it will help me to have a good book.
Okay, I will finish the conversation, but